Hey all, this is Paul from Drums and Rums, where the backbeats meets the spirits. Well, in this episode here, I'm going to go ahead and talk about a little bit about me. I know for those who've been listening for quite a few years, you may know a little bit about me, some of my stories. Again, most of this podcast has been interviewing drummers, musicians, people of interest, rum people in the industry, etc. But I guess I've never maybe done an actual introduction, if you're ever listening to the podcast, of who I am or how I got into drums. So this episode here is about some stories about how I got into drums, some of the bands I've been in, or pursuit of music endeavors, and some of the stories along the way. Thanks for tuning into the B3 Podcast Network there. So as you know, if you've been listening for a while, as I mentioned, thank you for being a faithful listener on the podcast channel, which was formerly known as Drums and Rums, and we kind of grew a little bit here, and we've expanded a couple shows here on this same channel that you've been listening to. So don't change your channel. You may look a little different, may have a different name, but Drums and Rums is still here. Obviously, this is this episode, as well as our Riffs and Rhythms podcast. That's where I'm a host with my co-host, Kevin McLaughlin there. It's a Riffs and Rhythm. He's a guitar player. Obviously, I'm the drummer, and we do a little bit of bantering. We hang out with some musicians. We do a band hang. We shoot the shit with musicians on their off night, usually Tuesdays, and that's kind of where we tape the episode. So definitely check out that episode. It's a little bit more fun, a little bit more risque maybe. So it's definitely like a party atmosphere here, chatting with musicians and listening to their stories. Also on the podcast network is, you've probably known this name for a long time. We've talked a lot about him. He's been on the show. I've been on his show, Brad Brock and the Jams and Cocktails podcast. Every Wednesday night, they are live streaming on YouTube. So definitely check that out, 8 p.m. So check that out on YouTube. And then the replay is every Thursday, which drops on the podcast network here on Spotify, Apple, etc. So again, if you're listening to this on the audio stream here on Apple, please go ahead and give us a rating and a review. Let us know how we're doing. What do you think? You hate it? Cool. Let me know. Spotify, I think, has that opportunity to do some ratings and reviews as well. But anyway, so all those things that are out of the way here, here's where we go. This is the story of Paul. Meet your host. So, like a lot of drummers always start out their stories that I've talked to, interview, there's always a story about how did they get into drums, right? Maybe it's a family member who was a musician. Maybe they saw something. And maybe like most kids, the story always is the pots and pans, banging on the pots and pans in the kitchen, right? So like a fellow guest that we had on earlier this year, Wally Timbalero, he talked about how when he was a little kid and he saw Tito Puente on the Sesame Street, and that kind of inspired him. He got into drums, and it became a huge influence in Wally's drumming, percussion, and playing the timbales. I'm no different, right? Growing up in the 70s, and as a kid watching, whether it's a Sesame Street, everyone watches Sesame Street, and for me, it was the Muppet Show. Now, I know this is going to sound very cliche because most drummers or everybody always talks about Animal, is, kind of wild, crazy. Well, he's Animal, and, he's a drummer, right? So, yeah, that for me growing up in this, early 80s, late 70s, watching the Muppet Show on TV, and that was very impressionable, is, obviously Animal, right? And that's kind of got maybe one of the start into it. Why didn't I pick guitar? I don't know, but that's kind of where we landed here with drums. So, obviously, growing up, Muppet Show, everyone's favorite Muppet. And actually, trivia question for those if you don't know, what band was Animal in that was on the Muppet Show? And it was called the Electric Mayhem. So, great name. That was a great name. Should start a band with that name. But anyway, so that's how I kind of grow up, again, here in the early 80s, and I've talked about this story a lot of times on the show, how I got first into drums was in elementary school, learning to play the snare drum in the music class, music teachers, and the story my mom always shares that she says she knew what day I had music class because it was always Wednesday, and that because she'd always hear me playing the drum before I went to school because I was supposed to be doing my lessons where I should have been doing it all week long. But you know what? If you're a parent or you had a parent who allowed you to play drums in the house and encouraged music, especially the drums, give them a big thank you because we all know the drums are the loudest instrument, and it's not that easy to listen to, somebody learning to play an instrument, especially one that makes a lot of noise. Maybe tuba or trumpet may be up there as well too, but playing the drums is loud, right? So it's not like guitar where you can be, unplugged. or acoustic, but drums are again allowed. So yeah, so that was my first foray into it. Unfortunately, it just never stuck. Kind of, I don't know, whatever it was, but here's me playing the snare drum. I look back now, kick myself after talking to all these great drummers, wishing. I don't want to say it's regret, but again, looking back, say, if I'd have done things differently, knowing what I know now, kind of thing. So that was very early on in my age. So up until that point, from that elementary time period, and it was a long stretch before I even got back into playing any type of instruments or any music. But this is where I did a lot of sports during this time period now. And then it wasn't until, obviously, like a lot of kids growing up in high school, you want to start a band, you listen to music, you want to rebel and all these things. Yes, I did have long hair at one point too, just like everybody. And went through, had a bunch of friends of mine that, some of them knew how to play guitar. And one of them, who's been on this podcast a couple times, a good friend when I grew up in New Jersey, was Craig Cohen. He actually could play guitar. He can read music, so he was pretty good. But again, it was just a fun goof kind of band. Maybe call it a Spinal Tap kind of vibe. A bunch of teenage boys and being stupid, silly. Probably not very appropriate in today's climate, but that's just the way it was. 80s hair metal, the Decadence and Motley Crue, Poison, all those hair bands. So growing up, I got back into a little bit into drums at the time because we were goofing around and trying to do something. And the name of this band was, again, typical boy, stupid boy vulgarity, was the Throbbing Membars. Yes, that's the Throbbing Membars. And, so again, very double entendre there. So grew up there, then I eventually moved down to Florida in the early 90s. And things kind of took a big hiatus again because now I'm moving to a new area, meeting new people, trying to get back into it. Again, didn't have the space for the drums. So it took a while for me to get back into it. So again, I've always been an on again, off again, kind of starting the drums back up. And this is now, we're talking about nearly a very long stretch for I'd say almost very close to nearly 10 years or so, because when I, moved into the house I'm currently in, that was when I've, picked the drums back up. Went and bought a kit, had in the house. Again, I have my own house now, no parents to yell at me, other than maybe my wife. But that was kind of where we're at this point here. So that was nearly 10 years, right? Again, still always into music, going to concerts and these things, but I always had that itch, right? There's always this itch that comes back that I want to play. So here we are, early 2000s time frame. You got a chance to hang out with a couple friends who are local, just jam, learn some songs, hang out. And again, nothing too serious. And again, we've probably talked very recently, if you listen to the Riffs and Rhythms podcast, who was a recent guest on the show, was JJ Rivera. JJ talked about, I was one of his first people he met and jammed with when he moved to South Florida. And, JJ and I would jam maybe a couple times, and then just life happens, things happen. I think we had hurricanes that year, and we just kind of separated. And, before Facebook, so we never really stayed in contact with each other. But again, same kind of moving forward, trying to do some things, and I've kind of been off again. And then, it wasn't probably until, that same time for a few years later, trying to meet up people. Again, before Facebook, you had to deal with Craigslist or a couple other online websites that people post looking for musicians, and, everything from, trying out for, I guess, what would you call the early 2000s kind of band, new rock, new metal kind of bands to, even a heavier, I got into some of the heavier stuff around the same time frame of 2005. Again, now I've got my kids are, starting to get, having kids now, and now it's a little tough playing drums. I don't have a place to practice, and again, we take a little bit of a hiatus again. So, the drums kind of went to a little bit to kind of put in the corner again, trying to take it serious, start. And again, look, we all have life. We all have things going on, other things that compete, which is very difficult. I can see why certain musicians choose not to marry, have kids, etc. If that sense. Again, having a career, having a job, family, etc. Mowing the grass. So again, things are trying to get going again. Trying to set the drum kit back up. Trying to jam with some friends again. Meeting some other people. And around this time frame, there was a little local music school in town that opened up, and they kind of was more about for kids, teaching kids how to learn music or the instruments, and then also the opportunity to, put together a little band, kind of go through that if they want to take it further. But also at the same place, they also had a band for adults, right? So adults they took guitar lessons, etc. And, so I met, he's been on the show, or we've talked a lot about, We've taped quite a few episodes actually at Live Music Community. So Justin Hucker is the owner, so a good friend of Justin. Again, he's still part of the community. So really great to see his shop and his school, I guess, really growing. So so that was kind of got involved with him, met a few people, some jams, and that's the thing. Somewhere along the line of all these stories here, there's always an open mic that I'm trying to get involved. And I'll tell you, open mics are very tough to kind of, when you're not a normal person that shows up, that, of course, there's maybe like two drummers, right? And again, those two drummers never want to give up the seat, right? Because, again, there's 20 guitar players that play their two songs on and off. Singers, drummers are not as many drummers, right? So, again, trying to be the new drummer in there, trying to get in there and jam and kind of get your foot, it's kind of tough, right? So, again, a lot of music here in the West Palm area, still trying to pursue, and then going through in probably the 2014 maybe time frame or so, getting involved with again, don't remember now how we stumbled across this, but an acoustic Americana kind of band feel. It was called Altered Roots. This was based here in South Florida, so it was the main guy who was a leader of the band. He played guitar and sang. We've had a lot of revolving during my time in that group. Different musicians, keyboard players, banjo players, and whatever. And so I was, at this time, this was an acoustic, so it wasn't drum kit based. So it was always, hey, what about this? Why don't you buy this? And I'm like, dude, I don't need to keep buying more percussion pieces, right? So that's how I acquired most of that stuff, was during that time frame. And again, I think I was just finally hitting that point where I just wasn't feeling it, just wasn't kind of vibing, and just wasn't exciting me. And maybe sometimes I stay too long and without kind of cutting loose. But anyway, we parted our ways, and that's kind of how that went. So a little bit now, jumping ahead back and going into the Live Music Community, and Justin's school there had an adult band. They were looking for a drummer, and so I kind of fit in there, hung out with these guys about my age. Again, nobody's taking things want to take too serious, but again, just to have a good time, just jam, play, learn some songs, and just hang out. Right, that's how a lot of people that are want to get together. So did that for a little bit of a while, and then in 2016, May of 2016. Again, another guest that we've had on the podcast over in Riffs and Rhythms was Billy T. And, so I met Billy at a gig. They had a fill-in drummer, found out they were looking for a drummer, introduced myself, and then the rest is history. We got together. First show was in like August of 2016, played a couple shows in the fall, and then, some more shows in the beginning of 2017. And then, just things didn't work out, and then we parted ways. And so again, that was a good, kind of an interesting band, time frame, a lot of rock, was in a band, with a couple of guys, and one of them actually I went on to, and I'll tell you in a minute, to do more music with. And so again, now here we're 2017, and now I'm in between, I'm not sure, trying to figure out things, what I want to do, what I want to play, trying to meet people. Again, it's always a challenge. And now we're looking at 2018 timeframe, I believe so, or maybe 2019 and somewhere in there. And a coworker of mine, had known somebody was a bunch of guys that were just jamming, playing, guitar players and learning some stuff. And some of the guys were at different levels of either guitar playing, endeavor. Some were a little further than others, and so it was, again, this is the formation of what we call the dad band that was a part of, which actually we rehearsed in practice in the same place we taped the Riffs and Rhythms show here in our little studio, and that I've kept since then. And again, it was a fun band hang, dad, hang. It was probably like the equivalency of going out and, if dad's going out and doing a bowling night thing, we'd hang out and had to drink a couple beers, play some songs, shoot the shit, and just talk about things, right? Again, we played maybe two parties, house parties, and that was about it. Again, we're now at the point of like late 2019, and about that same time I went to Nashville. I've talked a lot about the Nashville trip and taking going to Jim Riley's drum dojo and coming back all energized, and also ironically was the same time the podcast idea started forming. So here we are at the end of the year before the pandemic happens in 2020. I'm in the dad band, and then I was trying to start up another band with the guitar player from the band I was mentioning was Sonic Sun, with Billy T, was with Vaughn Jackson, and the bass player Brad, who was in the dad band with me, as well as a good friend of mine, Chris Springer, soloist. He's a full-time musician, singer, soloist. So it was like, got a great parts, got a real good guitar player, a guy who can really sing and very soulful. And then Brad and I have been playing together for many years now. So I think this has really got a really unique thing. But again, things just didn't kind of materialize, and fit. And I don't know, just it kind of went away. The dad band kind of at the same time dissolved. So before lockdown happens, pandemic happens, now both my music projects have just blown apart roughly in almost the same week, right? So now here I'm back to zero with any type of music. So thus, this is where the genesis of the podcast finally happens, because now, what do I do? How do I kind of keep my creativity, my outlet? How do I finally get off the pot with this idea of the podcast? Little did I know we were going to go into lockdown and then be forever and change and all that. But realistically, I haven't actually had a chance to really play the drums as much. I play here and there, maybe I jam with Kevin, my co-host on Riffs and Rhythms, or, I'll fill in here and there, but just still hasn't taken the bite. Again, now that I'm doing 2 podcasts, producing, the whole podcast network, still got, day job, family, grass cutting, family, and all these things. It's like, when the hell am I going to actually have time? But I'll have to say, I've got the itch, right? And the cool thing is about me doing this podcast is just talking to people, and especially talking to drummers and learning from them, listening to their stories. How did they start out? Certain techniques, certain things that they've done. I just find it very interesting, maybe I don't sometimes realize the opportunity talking to a lot of great musicians and, being able to glean a little bit of knowledge from them all. So that's kind of where we're at. Again, there was a lot of I'm probably forgetting half the stories too, and that are probably aren't as memorable as some of these ones along the way. But yeah, it's all these things, even my kids would got dabbled a little bit into music for a little bit. I didn't want to push them too hard into it, but but they kind of, I don't know, kids today, if you want to call it that, right? So, but that's the kind of the story here. Again, I know I don't get a chance to probably talk about me, obviously, because I'm always talking to guests and want to learn more about them. But I just figured, maybe this is an opportunity to go ahead and tell my story, right? Meet your host. And this is your host, Paul Robertson, for the Drums and Rums podcast, almost in its 5th year. Next March, we're coming up in March, it'll be in 5 years we've been doing the podcast. So again, I appreciate y'all for listening. Again, give us a rating, give us a review, drop us a line on social media, hit us up, send us an email, go to the website, whatever. I'm over on all the social media. If you want to hit me up, if you want to be a guest, let me know. And I definitely appreciate all the people that are listening, watching us on the YouTube channels, and don't forget also to check out the other shows as well, Riffs and Rhythms. Again, it's still staying within the same realm of some of the genre of stuff we're doing, what we're all about, Jams and Cocktails. Make sure you go check out Brad's show and support his podcast. Again, we're trying to grow together. So I'm trying to grow more podcasts. Are you a podcast that fits the same kind of genre of things that we're doing? Hit me up. So, like I said, again, I appreciate you all tuning in here. Don't forget to give us a rating and review over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and just, wherever you listen. Thank you for listening to wherever you get your podcast from, and appreciate. Have a great night. Thanks, y'all. Cheers.